The storm should have killed anyone caught in it. That was the first thought that slammed into Luke Callahan's mind the moment he saw the shape half buried in the endless white. The winter storm raging through the Montana mountains in 1882 was not simply weather. It was something darker. Something alive. The wind did not blow, it screamed. It clawed at a man's face like icy talons, and tore the breath straight out of his lungs. Snow spun in violent spirals that swallowed the land whole, burying trees, trails, and sometimes men themselves beneath a suffocating blanket of white silence. Luke had lived in Montana long enough to know the truth about storms like this. They killed, quietly, without mercy. He pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, though the thick wool barely made a difference anymore. The cold had already seeped through every layer and settled deep into his bones like a slow poison. He had been riding for hours. Hours of fighting the storm. Hours of searching the hills for his scattered cattle. Hours of finding nothing but loss. 3 calves had frozen stiff against a drift near the Lower Ravine. Their small bodies curled together as if they had tried to stay warm in their final moments. A yearling had been found half buried beneath snow near the ridge, its eyes glassy and empty. Each loss felt like another quiet wound in Luke's chest. Out here, every animal mattered, every life counted. The storm didn't care. Now he was turning Bess back toward the small log cabin he called home, his shoulders aching, his beard crusted with frozen ice. The wind pushed against them like an invisible wall. Then suddenly Bess stopped. The horse planted her hooves firmly into the snow and refused to move another step. Luke frowned. "Bess," he muttered through numb lips. But the horse tossed her head nervously and snorted, the sound sharp and frightened. Something ahead had caught her scent. Luke squinted through the violent curtain of snow. At first he saw nothing, just the endless swirling white. Then slowly, a dark shape began to emerge from the storm. It wasn't a tree. It wasn't rock. It was too smooth, too large. Luke nudged Bess forward carefully. The shape grew clearer. A carriage, a fancy one. Not the kind meant for these harsh mountains. The carriage lay tipped onto its side like a broken toy thrown into the snow by a careless child. One wheel had snapped completely off and lay half buried nearby. Luke felt his stomach tighten. City folk, the storm must have caught them on the pass. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching into the deep snow. The wind screamed around him as he approached. One horse lay dead beside the wreck, its stiff legs pointed helplessly toward the grey sky. A trunk that burst open when the carriage overturned. Silks and fine dresses spilled across the snow, frozen stiff like colorful ribbons trapped inside ice. This wasn't a trader's wagon. This was wealth, and wealth traveling alone in the mountains was never a good sign. Luke scanned the snow carefully. Then he saw them, tread marks. His heart gave a hard thump. Someone had crawled away from the wreck. The trail was messy and uneven, half buried by the storm already, but Luke followed it. Step by step, the wind cut through his shirt now that he had left Bess behind. Snow stuck his eyes, but he kept moving. The trail ended 20 yards away at a small snowdrift. At first, he thought the shape was just another lump of snow. Then he saw the hand. Small, pale, half buried. Luke's chest tightened. He rushed forward and dropped to his knees in the snow. The woman lay curled into herself like a frozen bird, her body twisted into the desperate shape of someone who had tried to survive the cold. Snow had already begun covering her. He rolled her gently onto her back, and for a moment Luke forgot how to breathe. She was young, far younger than he had expected. Her skin had turned a pale blue from the cold. Frost clung to her eyelashes, sealing them together. Strands of dark hair stuck to her frozen cheeks. Her fine wool coat had been torn open, leaving her chest exposed to the brutal wind. She looked like she had stepped out of a warm parlor somewhere in the east and walked straight into the jaws of winter itself. For a moment, Luke thought she was already dead. The mountains took people like that all the time, but something inside him refused to accept it. His bare fingers pressed gently against the side of her neck. The cold bit into his skin instantly. He waited. Prayed. Then a faint flutter. Weak, barely there, but real. Life. Luke released a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Come on, he muttered softly through chattering teeth. His voice sounded rough in the howling wind. You ain't dying today. He quickly stripped of his heavy coat and wrapped it tightly around her frozen body. The storm immediately punished him for it. The cold hit him like a blade sliding beneath his ribs, but he ignored it. Saving her mattered more. Getting her onto the horse was not easy. Bess reared nervously when Luke approached with the motionless woman in his arms. The horse could smell death on the wind. Luke spoke softly, steady and calm. It's all right, girl. Easy now. Slowly, Bess calmed. Luke lifted the woman sideways across the saddle. Then he climbed up behind her. He pulled her tightly against his chest, wrapping his arms around her small body. She felt impossibly cold, like holding winter itself. The ride back to the cabin felt endless. The storm continued its violent assault, biting through Luke's shirt and chewing into his muscles. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, but he held her close, trying to give her whatever warmth he had left, trying to keep her alive. Finally, through the swirling storm, Luke saw it. His cabin, the small log structure barely visible against the endless snow. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing, but right now it looked like salvation. Luke slid off Bess and lifted the woman into his arms. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, but he forced himself forward. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a heavy thud. Suddenly silence. The storm's roar vanished, leaving only the faint crackle of the empty hearth. Luke laid the woman carefully on the bearskin rug near the fireplace. His hands shook as he quickly gathered wood and struck a match. The flame caught. Slowly, then the fire began to grow. Warm light filled the cabin. Luke turned back toward her. Now that he could truly see her, the sight made his stomach twist. Her fingers had turned white. Her boots were frozen solid. Her lips were cracked and pale. She looked like someone who had already crossed halfway into death. Luke had seen Frostbite before, too many times. He knew exactly what it could do to a person without wasting another second. He began cutting away her frozen clothing, boots first, then the silk stockings, then the soaked layers of coats and blouses that had done nothing to stop the mountain cold. Luke kept his eyes low, not out of embarrassment, but out of respect. The cold didn't care about modesty, but he did. He wrapped her quickly in every wool blanket he owned. Then he forced a small splash of whiskey between her frozen lips. Most of it spilled down her chin, but a little went in. Next, he melted snow by the fire and gently rubbed her hands and feet. Slowly, carefully, painfully, color began to return to her skin. Red, angry, but alive. Hours passed. Outside, the storm crushed the world beneath it. Inside, the fire grew steady and strong. Luke finally sank into his only chair. A cup of coffee warming his numb hands, his tired eyes stayed fixed on her, watching, waiting. Her breathing was still shallow, fragile, but steady. Then near dusk, her eyelids fluttered. Luke leaned forward slightly. She gasped suddenly, pulling in a sharp breath as her eyes flew open. Fear filled them instantly, wild, confused. She tried to sit up, but the blankets tangled around her body. Where am I? She whispered hoarsely. Luke kept his voice calm, soft. My cabin, he said. I found you in the snow. Her eyes studied him quickly. His untrimmed beard, his scarred hands, the rifle hanging on the wall. the small rough cabin around them. Panic flickered across her face. My carriage, she whispered weakly. And the men? Were there men? Luke shook his head slowly. Didn't see anyone, he said. The storm covered everything. Her throat tightened. Then she looked down at the blankets wrapped around her. A deep blush touched her pale cheeks. I cannot pay you. Luke looked away slightly. Jaw tightening, wasn't asking for pay. He handed her a bowl of hot broth. She drank slowly, her hands trembling. The frostbite had blistered the tips of her fingers purple when he asked her name. She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she said softly, Anna. Luke heard the lie as clearly as a gunshot, but he said nothing. Instead, he simply nodded. You're safe here. Anna. He glanced toward the snow-covered window. Storms got us snowed in for days, but safety didn't feel like the right word. Not with the tension slowly filling the tiny cabin. She watched him carefully, like he might be a wolf standing too close, and Luke didn't quite know what to do with another human being suddenly inside his quiet world, especially one like her. Night slowly settled over the mountains, and outside the storm continued to scream. Night wrapped itself around the small cabin like a heavy blanket. Outside, the blizzard continued its furious assault on the mountains. The wind slammed into the log walls with the force of a charging animal, rattling the shutters and making the whole structure groan as if the cabin itself were fighting to survive. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. The orange glow painted long shadows across the rough wooden floor. Luke moved quietly around the small space, adding another log to the fire before stepping back toward the door. He spread his bedroll across the floor near the entrance. Anna, or whatever her real name was, watched him carefully from the bunk. Her body was still weak, but her eyes were awake now, alert, observant. She kept the wool blankets pulled tightly around her shoulders, as if they were the only barrier between her and the harsh world outside. You should take the bed, she said softly. Luke shook his head without looking up. You're sick, but it is your home. He shrugged. Doesn't matter. The simplicity of his answer seemed to confuse her. She studied him for a moment longer, as if trying to understand the man who had carried her out of a storm that should have killed her. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. Her eyes closed slowly, her breathing becoming softer and deeper. Luke leaned back against the wall near the door, his rifle resting across his knees. Sleep came slowly to men like him. Years of living alone in the mountains had taught him to listen even while resting. Every creak, every shifting log, every strange sound in the night could mean danger. But sometime after midnight, a soft voice broke the silence. At first, Luke thought he was dreaming. Then he realized the sound was real. Anna was speaking. No whispering. Her body twisted beneath the blankets as she thrashed restlessly against the fever burning through her. Langley. No, please. Luke sat up immediately. Her breathing had become quick and uneven. They took it. They took the ranch. Her voice cracked, filled with fear and confusion. Luke walked over carefully. Her face was pale again, sweat glistening across her forehead despite the cold. She gasped suddenly and her eyes flew open. For a moment, she didn't recognize where she was. Panic exploded inside her expression. She scrambled backward on the bunk, trying to escape someone who wasn't there. Luke held up his hands calmly. Easy. He said gently, You're dreaming. Her breathing came in sharp bursts. Slowly, the panic faded as she recognized the cabin around her, recognized him. The fear drained from her face, replaced by exhaustion. Her body trembled violently, without thinking. She leaned forward, her forehead pressed lightly against Luke's chest. He froze. Human contact had been rare in his life these past few years. But he didn't push her away. Instead, he carefully placed one rough hand on her back. She felt small, fragile, like something the storm might still steal away if he didn't hold her steady. Her breathing slowly calmed, and within minutes, She had fallen asleep again. Still leaning against him, Luke stayed there for a long time, listening to the storm, feeling the faint warmth of another human being close to him. Something inside his chest stirred quietly, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, two strangers shared the only warmth left in the frozen mountains. Morning arrived slowly. The sky outside the small window glowed with a pale grey light that made the snow appear endless and cold as iron. Luke woke stiff and sore. Anna was no longer leaning against him. She sat upright on the bunk now, wrapped tightly in blankets, watching him. Her eyes were different this morning, sharper, more cautious. The fever had burned away during the night, leaving behind a clear and calculating awareness. She was studying him, measuring him, trying to decide something. Luke pushed himself to his feet and walked to the fire. Morning. He grunted. He stirred the coals and added fresh wood. The flames rose again, filling the cabin with warmth. The coffee's hot, he said, pouring some into a tin cup. She accepted it carefully. Thank you, Luke. Her voice sounded steadier now, but her hand still trembled slightly as she drank. The frostbite had left her fingers blistered and red. They looked painfully delicate compared to Luke's broad, scarred hands. She was not built for this land, that much was clear. Where exactly are we? She asked quietly. Luke leaned back against the table. 40 miles north of Bozeman. He nodded toward the window. Pass is buried now. Nothing moving in or out for a while. Her expression darkened. She stared into the fire. Luke noticed the way her jaw tightened. Whatever she had been running from, the storm had trapped her with it. By midday, she finally began speaking more freely. The quiet at the cabin forced conversation between them. Two strangers sharing the same fire, the same space, the same uncertain safety. I was traveling to Bozeman, she explained while mending a tear in her skirt with careful stitches. Luke noticed how precise her sewing was, every movement graceful, refined. Alone? He asked. No. Her needle paused. I had a driver and a guard. Luke didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Her voice lowered. We were ambushed. The word hung in the air like smoke. 3 men. She continued quietly. They shot the driver first. Her hands began to shake again. My guard tried to fight them. But, her voice faltered, they pushed the carriage of the trail. Luke pictured the wreck he had seen, the broken wheel, the dead horse. It made sense now. I ran, she whispered. I don't remember how far. I just ran. Her eyes filled with emotion she was trying desperately to hide. I thought they were behind me. Luke nodded slowly. You ran, he said simply. That's why you're alive. She looked at him, searching his face for judgment, but there was none. Only quiet understanding. The storm continued to rage all afternoon. By evening, the cabin felt smaller than ever. Luke sharpened his knife near the fire. Anna continued mending her clothes. Snow piled higher against the window. Then she spoke again. My father died 2 months ago. Luke glanced up. She stared into the fire as she spoke. He left me his ranch. Luke paused. A woman owning a ranch in Montana was rare, very rare. Her clothes, her voice, her manners. None of it belonged to an ordinary rancher's daughter. But she hadn't told him the name of the ranch, and Luke noticed she avoided it carefully. Like it was the last secret she still controlled. There was a foreman. She continued quietly. Silas Morgan. Luke's eyes narrowed slightly. Morgan said my father promised the ranch to him. Her fingers tightened around the fabric when I refused to sign it over. Her voice hardened. He turned the men against me. Luke leaned forward. You ran from him. She nodded slowly. I was going to find the territorial marshal. The fire crackled softly between them. Luke studied her trembling hands. She looked fragile. But there was iron in her voice, a quiet strength, the kind that came from surviving something terrible. The storm finally ended the next morning. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural. The sky was clear. The world outside had transformed into a blinding white wilderness. Snowdrifts rose higher than a man in some places, Victoria still pretending to be Anna stepped outside the cabin door. The sight took her breath away. The mountains shimmered beneath the morning sun. It looked beautiful, peaceful, untouched. It's beautiful, she whispered. Luke stepped beside her. It's deadly. And then the sound came. A long, haunting howl. It echoed across the valley. Victoria stiffened. What was that? Luke didn't answer right away. Another howl joined the first. Then another. A pack. Luke turned and walked back inside the cabin. He grabbed his rifle. Wolves, he said. Her eyes widened. There are too many. Luke checked the chamber calmly. Stay inside. He moved toward the door. Don't open it unless you hear my voice. Fear flashed across her face. Where are you going? They'll go for the mule first. He nodded toward the small shed nearby. And if we lose that mule, he looked back at her. We're stuck here till spring. Before she could protest, Luke stepped outside into the deep snow. The door shut behind him. Victoria rushed to the frost-covered window. Her breath fogged the glass. She could barely see anything through the bright snow, just faint shapes. The shed, the empty valley. Then suddenly chaos exploded. A mule screamed. The rifle cracked. Like thunder, a deep snarl echoed across the snow. Victoria's heart pounded violently. Luke, but the wind swallowed her voice. Another rifle shot. More snarls. Snow burst into the air as shapes moved violently outside. Then a heavy thud. Silence. Long, terrible silence. Then a knock. Weak, struggling. Victoria. Luke's voice came through the wood. Open the door. Her hands shook as she tore the wooden bar loose. She pulled the door open. Luke collapsed inside. Blood and snow covered him. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. A deep wound tore through the flesh. Victoria gasped. Oh my God. Luke tried to shrug. It's nothing. Her expression hardened instantly. That is not nothing. She grabbed his shoulders. Sit. For the first time since meeting her, Luke obeyed without argument. The blizzard that brought her home. Luke sat heavily in the chair near the fire as Victoria knelt beside him. Blood soaked through his sleeve and dripped slowly onto the wooden floor. The bite from the wolf had torn deep into the flesh of his arm, leaving ragged edges that made Victoria's stomach twist. But she forced herself to stay calm. Panic would not help him. Hold still, she said firmly. Luke gave a weak smirk. You always this bossy? She didn't smile. Instead, she grabbed the bottle of whiskey and poured it directly over the wound. Luke sucked in a sharp breath as the liquid burned through the torn flesh. Hell, don't move, she snapped. Her hands worked quickly now, faster than she expected. The fear that had once made her tremble had transformed into something stronger, determination. She pressed a clean cloth into the wound and began binding it tightly. Luke watched her silently. A few days ago, this woman had been half dead in the snow. Now she was saving his life. You get the mule? She asked quietly while tying the bandage. Luke nodded once. Yeah. A pause. Got one of the wolves too. Victoria looked up at him then. Their faces were suddenly very close. The firelight flickered across his features, the rough beard, the small scowl along his jaw, the quiet strength in his tired eyes. His breath brushed softly against her cheek. For a moment, neither of them moved. Something passed between them. Not just gratitude. Something deeper. Something neither of them quite understood yet. Luke's rough hand shifted slightly and rested over hers. Warm, protective. Victoria froze. Then Luke seemed to realize what he had done. He pulled his hand away quickly. It'll heal, he muttered awkwardly. Night fell quietly after that. But something had changed inside the cabin. They were no longer strangers. not truly. Later that night, Luke woke to find the bed empty. Victoria stood near the frost-covered window, staring out into the moonlit snow. The mountains glowed pale silver beneath the night sky. Her shoulders looked tense, like someone carrying a weight too heavy to set down. "You should be sleeping," Luke said softly. She turned slightly. I tried. Her eyes reflected the pale moonlight. "I don't think I've been safe for a very long time." Luke didn't know what to say. So he didn't say anything. Silence sometimes spoke better than words. She walked slowly back toward the bunk, but as she passed him, her hand brushed gently against his shoulder, a small touch. Yet it sent a strange warmth through his chest. Outside, the world remained frozen and silent. Inside, something fragile had begun to thaw. The next days passed in a strange rhythm. The storm had ended, but the snow still trapped them in the mountains. Luke spent hours outside checking the rich and the remaining cattle. Victoria stayed inside tending the fire, cleaning dishes, and slowly regaining her strength. Yet tension lingered quietly between them. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. One afternoon, Luke returned from the ridge looking different. His face had gone pale. He closed the cabin door slowly behind him. Then he placed something small and frozen onto the wooden table. A leather tag. Victoria picked it up. The moment she saw the name carved into the surface, her breath stopped. Morgan. The room suddenly felt too small, too tight. Her hands began to tremble. "He found me," she whispered. Luke leaned against the wall, his expression grim. "Who are you really?" The question hung heavy in the air. Victoria sank slowly onto the stool. Her shoulders slumped. The lie she had been hiding shattered quietly inside her chest. "My name," she whispered, "is Victoria Langley." Silence filled the cabin. Every rancher in Montana knew that name. The Langley Ranch wasn't just land, it was power. It controlled half the valley. Luke felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. He had rescued a stranger from a storm. But she wasn't just a stranger. Victoria lifted her eyes. Tears shimmered there now. "Silas Morgan was my father's foreman." Her voice trembled. "When my father died, Morgan said the ranch had been promised to him." Luke's jaw tightened. "He tried to force me to sign it over." Her fingers curled into fists. "When I refused," her voice cracked, "he killed my driver." My God! He destroyed the records. Tears finally slid down her cheeks. "He left me for dead." Luke stared at the floor. He had seen evil in men before, but this kind of greed was something else entirely. "They want me gone," she whispered, "so they can steal everything." Luke slowly walked to the door. He pressed his shoulder against it. "They'll be here by dark." Victoria's breath caught. "Can we run?" Luke shook his head. "Not in this snow." His voice was steady. "We make a stand." He handed her the heavy revolver. Her hands trembled. "I can't." "You can." His eyes met hers. "Point. Breathe. Pull." Together they prepared. They boarded the window, loaded rifles, and waited. Dusk fell across the valley. The snow turned deep blue beneath the fading light. Then voices broke the silence. "This is Callahan's place." Morgan's voice echoed through the cold air. "Victoria, we know you're in there. Come out, girl." Victoria's heart pounded so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. Luke crouched beside the rifle slot in the wall. "Stay low," he whispered. Movement appeared between the trees, a shadow creeping forward. Luke fired. The rifle cracked through the valley. A scream followed. Gunfire exploded outside. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, sending splinters flying across the room. Victoria dropped to the floor. "Stay down," Luke shouted. The door shook violently. "Break it down." Someone yelled outside. An axe slammed into the wood. Again. Again. "Victoria!" Luke yelled. "Window." He shoved the second rifle into her hands. The axe struck again. The door splintered. Luke suddenly ripped the bar loose and flung the door open. The man swinging the axe barely had time to look surprised before Luke fired. The body fell backward into the snow. Luke slammed the door shut again. More bullets hammered into the logs, to down. Luke breathed. 4 to go. Then Morgan's voice roared through the darkness. We'll burn it down, Callahan. Silence followed. Long, terrible silence. Then hoofbeats, fading. Luke waited nearly 10 minutes before lowering his rifle. They're gone. Victoria collapsed onto the floor. The fear, the tension, the shaking. It all broke loose at once. But Luke suddenly swayed. Victoria looked up. His sleeve had turned dark with blood. The wolf bite had torn open again. Luke. He sank heavily beside the fire, his face pale. Victoria rushed to him. Her hands moved fast now, cleaning the wound, stitching the torn flesh. He didn't make a sound, not once. When she finished, her hands were covered in his blood. She stayed kneeling beside him. Their eyes met. You saved my life, she whispered. Luke's voice was rough. And you saved mine. The tension between them suddenly felt sharp and electric. The fire crackled softly. Luke reached up and brushed a streak of soot from her cheek. Their faces were inches apart. Victoria closed her eyes. Luke kissed her. The kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't slow. It was desperate. Two people had come too close to death. Her hands gripped his shirt. His arm wrapped around her, holding her like she was the only warm thing left in the frozen world. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Night settled quietly around them. She rested her head against his shoulder. He rested his chin against her hair, and neither of them spoke. Morning brought new danger. Luke returned from the ridge pale as snow. They're coming back. More men. Victoria stood. What do we do? Luke looked at her carefully. We go to your ranch. She swallowed. Morgan's there. It's the only place with walls stronger than this cabin. They packed quickly. Luke's arm throbbed with pain. Victoria helped him saddle the horse. Then they rode, through deep snow, through freezing wind. Luke grew weaker. Fever burned through him. Victoria held him upright in the saddle. Stay with me, she whispered. Finally, they reached the Langley ranch. Smoke rose from the chimney. Morgan's inside. Luke said. Victoria stared at the house. That is my home. Luke handed her the rifle. Stay here. She shook her head. No, and before he could stop her, she walked toward the house. Morgan stepped outside when he saw her. A cruel grin spread across his face. Well, look what the storm dragged in. Victoria stood tall. I am Victoria Langley. You are trespassing on my land. Morgan laughed. Girl, you isn't got no land. This ranch is mine now. No. A weak voice rustled. It isn't. Luke stumbled from the trees, barely standing. Morgan fired instantly. The bullet struck Luke. He collapsed into the snow. Victoria screamed. Morgan raised his gun again. Victoria lifted the revolver. Her arms were steady. She fired. The shot echoed across the valley. Morgan fell. The remaining men dropped their guns and fled. Victoria ran to Luke. She fell to her knees beside him. Stay with me. His breathing was faint, but alive. Weeks later, Luke stood on the porch of the Langley ranch. His wounds had healed slowly. Victoria stood beside him. The valley stretched wide before them. The ranch was hers again. He had begun packing his saddlebag that evening, believing he didn't belong there. But Victoria found him in the barn. She took his hand. You are home, she whispered. You are mine. Luke dropped the reins, and this time he stayed. Together they rebuilt the Langley ranch, and somewhere between the mountains, the storms, and the long summer grass, two broken souls finally found the peace neither of them believed they deserved.